Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for my 1/6 scale SDKFZ 222 armored car. Since the last video, work has been done on the model's chassis and box frame, and we will be going over that in this video. As what was also mentioned in the last video, the kit does supply you with two basic rails for the frame to be glued to the model's floorboards, and then from there you would assemble the superstructure. But on this model, I wanted to go ahead and give the model a nice detailed chassis and running gear. To do so, several mods had to have been made to the chassis, as well as a little bit of scratch building. Before we can go on for describing all of these details, some mods had to have been made to the side frames themselves. For that, we need to go back to see what it looked like when I first cut it off the sprue. Before I can start fabricating anything, these two pieces of the frame need to be removed from the runner. Now, to remove the sections of plastic, we notice that since this is a laser cut kit, as I mentioned before in the unboxing video, that the pieces are cut with a laser precisely from the material. The only places where they connect are in certain small little portions, like right here and right here. The best way to cut them off is with the Dremel Multimaster, or the Multimax like I have right over here. For this, I'll be using the half moon attachment. Just like I did on my Panzer II video, this half moon here will slice right through this plastic with no problems, leaving no burrs, and will safely remove the piece from the stock without any fear of it breaking or it rupturing somewhere else on the runner itself. To remove the pieces, it looks something like this. Simply line the blade into the slit and remove the burr. The piece now is removed from the runner. Do this to all sections where it connects. And here go the sections now removed. It's a nice clean cut. However, there's still a little bit of burr on here. The burr is easily removed with a file and some sandpaper. Once the frame panels are removed from the sprue, it is then time to start assembling your chassis. Now, on my vehicle, I'm going to be doing a super detailed chassis, and to do that, I need to make some mods to the kit frames themselves. Namely, to start with, the frame side panels are a little bit too fat. Now, this is probably because that these panels here are probably recycled from a different armored car, say like a 261. As we can see here, the frames are a lot fatter than that of a 222, and they have this little drop down on each side where the wheels are. If you notice, that's present here in this kit. Since they're too wide for the 222, I needed to go ahead and shorten them. To know exactly how to shorten them, I needed help from my 1/35 scale 222 project that I'm building along with this 1/6 scale version for help. For the small model, I'm going to be using this Hobby Boss 1/35 scale 222 armored car kit. The kit itself is nicely detailed and has a nicely detailed chassis, of which I can go ahead and scale up and use it for reference. Before I went ahead and glued all these parts together on the 135 version, I went ahead and scaled the side frame from the kit in my computer. In my computer, I then went to Photoshop and then I adjusted and cropped everything to make it the same dimensions as the frames here, namely the length. Once I resized it in Photoshop, I printed it out, taped it together, and went ahead, and now I have my template. I went ahead and marked where the pieces needed to be removed, and once marked, I went ahead and, with the help of the scroll saw, removed the extra plastic. Now the dimensions of the panel are more to scale. The scroll saw itself did a decent job of removing the extra plastic from this piece. However, if we notice, the piece here still isn't square. It's a little bit rough and wibbles a little bit from where I used the scroll saw to cut it. To square it off, I'm going to need to use the mill. Here's the mill over here. The headstock is already set to the proper height from the vise. Now, the one advantage that I have with using the mill is that the one half of the panel was laser cut, so it's already nicely squared off. Since this is squared off, I could easily just fit it inside this vise here, clamp it, and we'll just run it right through the mill. As long as this is square, the mill will mill away all the extra remaining residue and leaving a perfectly square piece. And it will look something like this. Since this part of the vise here is where the piece is held the most secure, what I do is I only mill away the portion here that's gripped in the vise. Once I hit the end, like where I just hit right now, I will loosen the vise, move the bit away from the stock, reset the vise, and once it's reset, I'm going to go ahead and move the plate further down, and that will leave me a new section to mill away. Like so. As long as I push down on the square portion here of the plastic and tighten the vise, it will stay the line will be continuous. Once it's tightened up, I could then restart with the milling. And here are both halves of the frame after the milling. They are now completely square and completely smooth. No sanding is required. Now, the same technique can also be done on a belt sander. However, you got to be careful because on a belt sander, you need to be careful with how you hold a piece on the sander because you could easily sand a little too much and have something off square. Once the piece has been resized and squared off, they are now ready for the next step, which will be to add bulkheads and to thicken off these plates to make them into more or less square tubing like it is on the real vehicle. After the frame pieces were squared off, they needed to be glued together. To get the proper thickness of this square tubing style frame, I needed to mount spacers on the in between the two layers of plastic. To do this, I cut several pieces of Plastruct 1/4-inch square tubing. These square tubing was cut into small segments, and then they were glued in small strips along the frame. Once the strips were glued on, the two pieces were the outer frame and the Lexan inner frame were glued together. To plate up the top and the bottom, strips of thinner sheet styrene were glued to the top and the bottom, thus encompassing and closing off the tube. The trickiest part in mounting or assembling the frame was making sure that the pieces were completely square. To do this, I had to come up with a way to jig the two frames in a way that I would have a consistent rectangular shape throughout the entire frame. Otherwise, you might have some yawing going on, and that would be unacceptable, especially when you start assembling the superstructure. Frame, I used a large framing square, which supported the first frame tube. For the second frame tube, I used a standard smaller square, like we have here. After I did some calculations, I measured out the proper width of the frame. I just lined up the two square pieces, and once I had a visual aid going, I was then able to fabricate the cross membranes on both the front and the rear portion of the vehicle. Once these cross membranes were permanently added, the frame was at a constant and solid shape. Themselves are comprised out of several types of materials. For the front, we have a rounded tube structure. The tube itself is a small piece of PVC tubing that has been solidified by being filled up with casting resin. Once the tube is filled with resin, it makes it more stronger and durable to mount to the sides. The cross frame in the back is made out of 1/4 inch acrylic sheet that has been cut and glued to the frames as well. In addition to glue, 2 small fasteners have been added which go through the frame tubing into the main struts. The fasteners, in addition to the glue, give the frame a lot more rigidity and more support. For the tank's secondary bulkheads, these have been all fabricated out of sheets of 1/8 inch Lexan plastic. The Lexan, which is crystal clear at first, is hit with some medium or fine sandpaper on a palm sander, giving it a nice dilute surface. This dilute surface makes gluing a lot more efficient and also helps with the paint adhesion when it's time to apply the primer and eventually the base coat. This Lexan construction method was also used on the front differential brace as well as the rear transmission mount and transmission guard mounts. The way the frame breaks up is as follows. This cross member here is used for both as a engine mount, where an engine 2 mounts will be added to this plate, as well as a mount for the rear differential that would be in the back. This very elaborate angled plate here, this structure, will be for mounting the armored car's transmission gearbox. The center span, or the center block here, is primarily the most rigid and strongest point of the H-frame and kind of holds the whole thing together. The box itself is where it has these 2 holes in it. For the first holes for where the main drive shaft will run through the rear differential, or from the rear portion of the gearbox into the front portion of the differential, which would be going through this bulkhead here. The second hole that we have here is going to be for, I believe, the push rod for the steering. However, more information on that is to follow. On the front portion of the armored car, this bulkhead here is where, actually both of these bulkheads here, is where the front differential will be mounted. Half of the differential is mounted to this support tube, and the other half is bolted securely to this bulkhead. Also, that is going to be attached to this bulkhead is the steering column and the steering Y or yoke that comes out of the bottom, which will then Y off for the both front and rear steering. In addition to all of the parts being mounted to the box frame, detail sculpted welds have been added to all of the pieces that have been added. The welds themselves are all hand sculpted out of a 2-part epoxy, and once dry, aid in both giving the frame some detail as well as giving these components a little bit of extra support. Now that the frame has been completed, it is now off to fabricate the model's running gear. This includes the front and rear differentials, the transmission housing along with the drive shaft, and as well as the independent suspension and steering. This project update video for this 1/6 scale SDKFZ 222 German armored car. Stay tuned for more progress on this model, as well as more detailed upgrades and components. Also, stop by and like us on Facebook. And also, don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 scale model builds and 1/6 scale detail components. Thank you.